Hey there, welcome. You're here with us today because, like a true philosopher, you really want to dig deep, right? You're interested in understanding the huge, complex forces that are shaping our world.
Absolutely.
And let's face it, few forces are as powerful and as tricky to wrap our heads around as, well, social networking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. These platforms, Facebook, X, WhatsApp, YouTube, they've become so much more than just ways to connect.
Yeah.
They're woven into the very fabric of how we interact, how we see ourselves.
They really are.
And they're reshaping public life, even democracy itself.
Yeah. That's where things get really interesting, especially for someone with a philosophical bent.
Right. I mean, for a philosopher, these platforms, they're not just tools. They're like case studies in how we're evolving as a species.
It's like they embody and project very specific ways of being and relating to each other. And that's fascinating and a little bit unnerving, right?
Totally. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to dissect the ethical frameworks that apply to these technologies. We want to give you, the listener, insights that really click with your analytical mind.
Like providing a philosophical toolkit.
Exactly. Now, to guide our deep dive, we're drawing on a pretty hefty source, the Social Networking and Ethics entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Well, that's a good one. It's really thorough.
Oh, it's dense. But that's our mission here, to unpack the core philosophical considerations surrounding SNS. Zero in on those fundamental ethical concepts and figure out how they play out in this, super rapidly changing digital world.
That's the key, applying these concepts to the digital terrain. The landscape's always shifting.
Always. Okay, so first things first. What do we even mean when we say social networking, right? Because people have been connecting with each other forever.
Right.
What makes this iteration unique, especially from a philosophical point of view?
Well, you've hit on a crucial distinction right there. For a philosopher, it's all about context. Humans have always been social creatures, always forming networks. But the contemporary understanding of social networking, how we use that phrase now, especially in philosophical discussions, it's tied to the rise of these information technologies. Specifically, the ones rooted in those Web 2.0 standards that came about in the early 21st century.
Web 2.0. Okay, so that was a turning point.
Absolutely. It was a huge turning point.
Yeah.
And the key shift with Web 2.0 was all about you. You, the user, became the creator. You could create content, distribute it. There's a whole new dynamic.
Like user-generated content became the engine.
Exactly. And that changed the whole feel of the internet. It became way less structured, way more dynamic, not like those old school online forums or anything.
So it wasn't just about connecting anymore.
No.
It was about control. Who had it? Who was shaping the experience?
Exactly. Web 2.0, it was all about collaboration, sharing, all this user-generated content on a scale that, was unprecedented, really.
Right.
And that was a massive contrast to the old internet.
Right.
Where you mostly had institutions and companies cranking out the content.
Like a one-way street.
Yeah. Web 2.0, it was designed to tap into that social energy, that human urge to connect. And the crucial part, one of the things that really made it take off, was the ease with which people could connect, what they were doing online, what they were posting with their offline networks, their friends, their family.
Right, so those lines got blurred, right?
They did. It was a big shift away from those anonymous spaces of the early internet. Real names, real identities. Suddenly, that was front and center online.
Okay, so take us back to those early days. Who are the pioneers, the big names, the first ones to really dive into this new Web 2.0 social networking scene?
Oh, wow. The list is pretty long. You had Orkut. Remember Orkut?
Yeah.
MySpace, that was huge for a while. And then LinkedIn came along, and Friendster, Bebo, even Habbo, all of them tapping into that new way of connecting.
And then, of course, the one that really changed the game.
Facebook.
Facebook, yeah. And then after that first wave, it was like an explosion.
Right.
Whoa.
So many specialized platforms popping up. You got media sharing with YouTube and Instagram, microblogging with X, which, of course, used to be Twitter.
Right.
Location-based networking, Foursquare was big in those days. Then came the messaging apps like WhatsApp. And then gaming platforms, Steam. Those became incredibly social.
It really is remarkable how quickly that whole ecosystem took shape. It was like a gold rush almost.
It was.
Okay, so as all this was happening, philosophers, those deep thinkers, they started paying attention, right? Asking, hold on, what are the ethical implications of all this? So where did they even begin? Was this like a totally new area of ethical inquiry?
It's a good question. In the beginning, the ethics of SNS, it was kind of seen as a subfield of computer and information ethics, which, if you trace it back, has its roots in the work of folks like James Moore and Deborah G. Johnson.
Okay.
But the thing is, SNS, it came along just as the field of internet studies was taking off. So right away, you had all these different perspectives coming in: sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, lawyers, political scientists even. And philosophers, well, they were faced with a choice. Do they work on their own, using their own traditional tools? Or do they engage with all this empirical data that all these other disciplines were generating?
So it was interdisciplinary from the start.
Very much so.
Has that continued?
Yes.
Or have other fields, like, taken over the conversation?
It's interesting. Lately, the really public debates about social media, especially the potential harms, those have been led mostly by sociologists, people in information studies, psychology. Philosophers, well, they've had a slightly less prominent voice, at least publicly. And there's another layer to this. Social scientists, they often frame their analyses in terms of like political frameworks, justice, human rights. Or they use psychology, looking at well-being. They're not always explicitly using ethics, like in a philosophical sense.
Wow, that's a really interesting point. As philosophers, it makes you think, is ethics as a philosophical discipline still the go-to framework for critically examining these technologies? Even the source we're looking at, it raises that very question.
It does. And there are a few reasons for that, I think. One reason is that applied ethics, it's become more and more, how should I put it, professionalized. And some people worry that it's getting too detached from social critique, like the broader picture.
I see.
Another thing is that corporations, they've started using ethical language a lot, but sometimes it's just for marketing, for PR.
Right.
It's ethics washing.
Yeah, that doesn't help.
And then there's this really fundamental question. Traditional philosophical ethics, a lot of it focuses on individual actions, individual intentions.
Right.
But with SNS, a lot of the harms, they're systemic. They're baked into the structure. So people are asking, are the old tools enough?
Big questions. Okay, so let's move on to some of those early philosophical critiques of online social networks.
Okay.
Our source highlights Albert Borgman and Hubert Dreyfus, two really influential thinkers. Both were super influenced by Heidegger, right? And his philosophy of technology.
Very much so.
So what were their big concerns about the early internet, those precursors to what we have today?
Well, both Borgman and Dreyfus, they were pretty critical of the internet, of online sociality in general.
Really?
Yeah. They thought it was lacking compared to, real-world human interaction. It just didn't have the same richness, the same depth.
Interesting.
And they were both coming at it from this Heideggerian perspective, this idea that technology, it's not neutral. It's a force that shapes our experience of reality, often in ways we don't even realize.
Okay, so let's start with Borgman. He introduced this concept of social hyperreality. What was he getting at with that, and why did he think it was ethically problematic?
So hyperreality, for Borgman, it was about how these online networks, they can kind of mess with our sense of reality, how we engage with the world.
Okay.
He argued that they encourage us to present like stylized versions of ourselves, idealized versions, often,
the best version of ourselves.
Right. It's all for show, really, to amuse others, to get their approval. It's not about genuine connection, vulnerability.
And he saw this as ethically dangerous.
Well, he didn't think presenting a better self online was bad in itself, but he was worried about the after effects. He thought it could make us feel dissatisfied with real life.
Right, because real life, it's messy.
It is. It takes effort, patience, to really be present with other people. And after spending time in this shiny, manufactured online world, real life can seem, well, kind of dull.
So it's that contrast that's the problem, the risk of becoming disconnected from the hard work, the vulnerability that real connection takes.
Exactly. Even if you get tons of validation online, you can still end up feeling empty.
And Borgman was also worried about, what did he call it, diminished presence in online communication?
Yes, he was.
So what did he mean by that, and what did he see as the ethical implications?
Well, he thought online communication, it's inherently thin, lacking.
How so?
Well, for one thing, you can disappear so easily online. You can block someone, ghost them, whatever. You don't have to deal with difficult encounters.
Right, you have all that control.
You do. And he worried that all those vast, far-flung online connections, they could make us detached from the unplanned encounters that actually make life interesting.
Yeah.
Running into someone at a concert or at a protest.
Right, like those little serendipitous moments.
Right. He called it a mobile attachment to the web of communication. Like we're stuck in this digital web, missing out on the joy of actual physical presence. And he thought we were missing out on something else, too. The experience of being judged by others, being seen in a shared space.
So it's not just about the pleasure of interaction, it's about accountability.
Exactly. He thought that being physically present with others, it makes us more aware of our impact on them.
But some people pushed back against Borgman, right? They said he was being too pessimistic, too deterministic, like he didn't appreciate the agency of users or the benefits of these technologies, especially for people who might be marginalized or isolated in the real world.
Right. People like Andrew Feinberg, they pointed out that online networks, they can be incredibly empowering, especially for people who are disadvantaged in traditional social structures. They can find community, organize, they can resist oppression.
So the internet, it's not just this force for bad.
Not at all. It depends how it's used, who's using it.
Okay, so then you have Hubert Dreyfus. He was also coming at this from a phenomenological perspective, but he had a slightly different focus. He zeroed in on the lack of risk in online interaction. How did he connect that to meaning and commitment?
Dreyfus, he was really interested in how we experience the world, how we make meaning. And he argued that online, well, there just isn't the same level of risk that you find in real-life relationships.
Because the stakes are lower.
Exactly. And he brought in Kierkegaard here. He argued that without real consequences, well, you can't have true meaning, true commitment.
Because you're not really putting yourself out there.
Right. He thought that a lot of the appeal of online social spaces was precisely because they were safe. You could experiment, you could play with different identities, different levels of commitment. You could dip your toe in without really diving in.
And he saw that as a weakness.
In a way, yes. He felt that real risk, the possibility of failure, of rejection, even of real harm, those are the things that make us grow, that make our relationships matter. They force us to develop a strong sense of self. Kierkegaard called it firmness, balance, and steadiness.
As opposed to what?
Variableness and brilliancy, which you could have plenty of online, but it's kind of superficial.
So the very thing that makes online interaction so appealing to many people, that it's low risk, consequence-free, that's what Dreyfus thought was ethically problematic.
Yeah. He wasn't saying it was impossible to have deep, committed relationships online. He was saying that anyone who is truly risking something real online, well, they'd be going against the very reason most people go online in the first place.
That's really interesting. Okay, so it's fascinating to look back at these early critiques, knowing how social networking has actually unfolded.
Yeah.
And our source points out that some of their predictions, well, they haven't exactly panned out.
That's true.
That they didn't quite anticipate how anonymity would fade away on so many platforms.
That's hard to predict the future.
It is. So Dreyfus, for example, he didn't foresee how central real-world identities would become on sites like Facebook, LinkedIn, even X, which used to be Twitter.
Right.
It's like anonymity is almost an anomaly now. And even after someone dies, their online presence lingers.
Right. Those digital traces are incredibly persistent. It's hard to erase them. And that raises a whole other set of ethical questions.
It does. And Borgman's worry about immobile attachment, the idea that we'd be tethered to our screens, isolated from real-world interaction, that hasn't quite played out either.
It hasn't. At least not in the way he imagined. Mobile social networking, location-based services, those have really changed things.
Right. Now we use our phones to meet up, to get together in the real world.
Exactly. Borgman, he didn't quite see that coming.
But even though some of their specific predictions were off, the core concerns, they still feel relevant, don't they?
They do.
So how do their anxieties about online sociality, how do those still apply today, even if things haven't unfolded exactly as they predicted?
Well, think about the work of Sherry Turkle. She started out pretty optimistic about the internet, but later on she became much more pessimistic. Her work on how social media can make us feel alienated, alone together, that echoes a lot of what Borgman was saying.
It does. And the source makes this really interesting connection between their work and the whole debate about cancel culture.
It does. And it's a connection I hadn't made before. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is.
Borgman and Dreyfus, they were worried that online actions wouldn't have consequences, that there wouldn't be real-world accountability.
Right.
But cancel culture, it suggests the opposite, doesn't it? That actions online can have huge, lasting, real-world consequences.
It's like the pendulum swung the other way.
Yeah. Now, the debate is often about whether there's too much judgment online, not enough forgiveness.
Right. And of course, there's the argument that this kind of online judgment, it's necessary. It's how we hold powerful people accountable.
That's the other side of the coin.
Right. And then you have Borgman's idea of social hyperreality. That seems especially relevant now with all the political disinformation, the erosion of shared reality we've seen in recent years. Think about Elections, public health crises.
Absolutely. Borgman's warnings about how a distorted online world could undermine civic virtue, our sense of a shared reality, those feel really prescient now.
They do.
I mean, think about it. Sophisticated disinformation campaigns on social media, conspiracy theories spreading like wildfire,
Yeah.
people no longer agreeing on basic facts.
It's scary.
It is. And it has real consequences.
It does.
The examples in the source, the Pizzagate stuff, the false narratives about the 2020 election, even that fact check about Hillary Clinton, they all point to this very real problem.
Yeah.
It's like we're living in different realities now.
And the pandemic, climate change, those just highlight how important it is to have a shared understanding of, well, reality, of facts. And social media, it can really undermine that.
Again.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about some of the more contemporary ethical concerns that have come up around SNS.
Okay.
The source talks about a shift in focus from those big picture transcendental concerns that we were just talking about to a more like empirically driven approach, more focused on data.
Right.
So what are the main categories of ethical issues that researchers are looking at today?
Well, most contemporary research on SNS ethics, it falls into three buckets. You have the direct ethical impacts. Those are the things that happen right on the platforms themselves in our interactions.
Okay.
Then you have the indirect impacts. Those are the effects that emerge from the behavior of, well, everyone, users and the platform providers themselves.
Right.
What happens at a larger scale?
Okay, I see.
And then you have the structural impacts. Those are the big picture changes to society, the ethical landscape, that are driven by, well, by the business models that underlie these platforms, how they make money.
Right, because those models, they incentivize certain kinds of behavior.
They do. Okay, so let's talk about privacy. That's a huge one, right?
It is. What are some of the key privacy issues that are being raised about social networking services?
The direct impacts on privacy are everywhere. It's kind of overwhelming, really. You have data being transferred to third parties, and a lot of times it's not even clear what's happening.
And it's often used for things that, well, that people might object to, right?
Right. Targeted marketing, surveillance. Then you have the use of user data to train facial recognition systems. Again, often without people's knowledge or consent. And then there's the data that gets collected by third-party apps that integrate with platforms like Facebook. It's a mess.
It does sound like a mess.
And then the platforms themselves, their privacy settings, they can be so complicated, so opaque. It's like they're not really designed for users to understand.
Right.
And of course, you have the issue of cookies, those little trackers that follow you all over the internet.
Yeah.
And SNS, they can be used for stalking, for harassment. Then there's the issue of researchers, academics, scraping data from these platforms without getting informed consent.
That's a whole ethical debate in itself.
It is. And then you have the government. Government agencies often get access to user data, sometimes secretly. And then, perhaps most importantly, you have the users themselves, what they choose to share, how much they think about the implications of their actions. You know, Facebook especially has been under fire for their privacy policies, for how they handle data.
Right, right. And it's not just about those direct actions, right? The things the companies do. There are all these indirect privacy problems that just come with the territory of online social networking.
Exactly. The whole point of social networking is sharing information. That's what makes it work. And the more you share, the more useful these platforms become, the more connected you feel.
Right, they reward sharing.
They do. And that's where the paradox comes in. Even if you give users granular control over their data, if they're constantly being encouraged to share more, well, overall, privacy decreases. For everyone.
So it's a structural problem. It's built into the system.
It is. And advertisers, data brokers, they don't necessarily care about your individual private facts. What they're after is patterns.
So they can predict behavior.
Right. And your data, it gets added to this huge pool used to create these sophisticated algorithms that can predict the behavior of large groups of people. So even if you feel comfortable sharing your own information, you might be compromising the privacy of others who are like you. It's a really complicated issue.
And then you have the conflict between users and the companies. Users, they want to connect, express themselves.
Right.
But the companies, they want to make money. And often that means exploiting user data. Jared Lanier, he's been very vocal about this, saying that the whole business model of a lot of these companies relies on violating user privacy.
He has. He's been pretty cynical about it.
The source also brings up how the way these platforms are designed, how they're structured, it can be insensitive to the complexities of our social lives. Like, it treats all our connections as the same, regardless of context.
It does. It flattens everything. You know, we have all these different kinds of relationships, family, work, friends, romantic partners.
Right.
And each of those relationships, it has its own set of norms, its own boundaries around privacy.
Yeah.
But online, those distinctions often get lost. The privacy settings, they just can't capture all that nuance.
And the source highlights this concept of contextual integrity as a way to think about this.
Right. Helen Nissenbaum, she's the one who developed that concept.
And what's the basic idea?
It's that privacy. It's not just about keeping things secret. It's about what's appropriate in a given context. Who's sharing what information, with whom, and for what purpose.
Right, so it's much more nuanced than just public versus private.
It is. Okay, now what about the users themselves? What about the whole privacy paradox? People say they care about privacy, but then they share all sorts of personal information online.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. The privacy paradox is well documented. People worry about privacy, but they still post. But there's some evidence that when users are given a clear choice about their data, they actually do choose to protect it.
Like that Apple feature.
Yeah. The app tracking transparency feature that came out with iOS 14.5, a lot of people opted out of tracking when they were given the option. So it suggests that maybe people do care about privacy, but they need to be given control, agency.
Right. And it needs to be easy.
Exactly. But then you have another perspective. Some people, drawing on Foucault's work, they argue that this whole idea of self-management when it comes to privacy, it's actually problematic.
Okay, how so? Well, the idea is that if individuals are responsible for protecting their own data, for making choices within these platform settings, then privacy becomes just another commodity, something you buy and sell in the digital marketplace. And that kind of reinforces a very neoliberal view of privacy, a very individualistic one.
And the argument is that that's not the right way to think about privacy.
Right, because it puts all the responsibility on individuals.
Right.
It ignores the power imbalance between users and the companies that control their data. And it ignores the systemic issues, the structural problems that are built into these platforms. So the debate is really about whether we need individual responsibility and structural reform.
Right, because those aren't mutually exclusive.
Exactly. Okay, then there's this other thing. Some users, they're taking a more subversive approach. They're fighting back against what they see as like digital totalitarianism.
How so?
By giving false information. It's like a form of digital civil disobedience.
Yeah.
They're deliberately introducing noise into the system, trying to mess with the algorithm.
So they're resisting surveillance by being untruthful.
Exactly. They see it as a way to protect their privacy, to resist control.
It's like a digital version of like wearing a mask in a crowd.
Right. It's about blending in, making yourself harder to track. Okay, and then the source reminds us that we can't talk about privacy without talking about culture.
Right.
What's considered private, what's considered acceptable to share, those are all shaped by culture. And in our increasingly interconnected world, that's super important to remember. For example, Wang points out that in many Confucian cultures, family privacy is considered way more important than individual privacy.
So it's not all about the individual.
No. And Capurro, he argues that our Western focus on individual privacy, it can sometimes overshadow other important ethical concerns, like protecting the public sphere from too much private intrusion. And that's a concern that's become even more urgent with the rise of mobile technologies, with constant connectivity and data collection.
Right. Okay, let's move on to identity and community. Those are two more huge areas that have been profoundly impacted by SNS. So how are philosophers thinking about these issues in this new digital landscape?
Well, increasingly, they're looking at SNS as what Foucault called technologies of the self. They're tools, platforms that we use to construct our identities, to perform them, to manage how others see us. And they're also looking at how communities form online, how they function, what ethical issues arise, both the kinds of communities that are like real-world communities and the ones that are totally unique to the digital space.
The source talks about how there's been a shift from anonymity to like a more direct link between our online identities and our real-world selves, especially on platforms like Facebook.
Right.
So how has that shift changed how we think about online identity and the ethical implications of that?
It's been a big change. In the early days of the internet, a lot of online communities, they embraced anonymity. People created avatars, used pseudonyms. It was all about playing with identity. But now, on platforms like Facebook, LinkedIn, X, the goal is to connect your online identity with your real self, with your offline social network.
So it's less about escaping your real identity and more about extending it.
In a way, yes. But even with that shift, SNS, they still give you way more control over how you present yourself than most offline situations.
Right. You can curate your image.
You can.
Mhm.
So our online identities, they're rooted in reality, but they're also, like the source says, reflective and aspirational. They reflect who we are, but also who we want to be.
And that raises a lot of ethical questions.
It does. Like, where do those aspirations come from? Are they healthy? How much do our online and offline identities align? Do our aspirational selves online motivate us to do good in the real world? Or do they make us feel more disconnected, more inauthentic? These are all things philosophers are grappling with.
And then you have this whole issue of Facebook profiles and other online presences persisting after death.
Right.
It's like, are digital ghosts?
It is. And it brings up all these deep ethical questions. What are our obligations to the dead? Do our identities, our reputations, do they have any meaning after we're gone? And what about the practical and ethical aspects of managing these digital remains?
Right. Do the dead have any rights when it comes to their online presence? It's mind-boggling, really.
It is.
Okay. And then you have the whole issue of narrow caste communities, echo chambers, filter bubbles. That's been a big concern, especially with all the polarization we've seen in recent years.
It has. And those concerns, they go way back. Marcel was writing about this early on, warning about the dangers of online communities where everyone agrees. And as algorithms have become more sophisticated, as they've taken over content curation, those anxieties have only grown.
Because they reinforce our biases.
Right? They feed us more of what we already like, what we already agree with. And that can make us more polarized, less tolerant of other viewpoints.
It's like we're all living in our own little worlds.
It is. And SNS, they could be a force for expanding our horizons, exposing us to different perspectives. But often, that's not what happens. The way they're designed, the way the algorithms work, it often leads to the opposite.
Right. And the source points out that online, we're also missing a lot of the nonverbal cues that help us understand each other.
Right. Tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, all that stuff that helps us make sense of what someone's really saying. Online, it's often just text. Or even with video, it can be very curated, very performative. So it's easier to misunderstand each other, easier to dehumanize each other. It's like we see each other as representatives of groups, of ideologies, rather than as individuals.
And then you have those really disturbing online communities. The source calls them inherently pernicious, like the pro-anorexia sites, the apotemnophilia communities.
Right. Places where people come together to encourage each other in really harmful behaviors. And that raises a huge ethical dilemma for the platform providers. Do they restrict access to these communities? Do they try to shut them down? But then what about freedom of expression? What about user autonomy? Manders Wheats, he argues that users have a right to manage their own identities, even if those identities are, well, problematic.
It's a tough balance. And the source also talks about how these platforms, they don't just facilitate our self-expression, they actively shape it, right? Through their categories, their metrics of popularity.
Yeah. Barkerjiva and Gayton, they make this point really well. They say that our online selves, they're shaped by the categories that the platforms give us. You know, the options we have for describing ourselves, for labeling ourselves. And then they're constantly being evaluated through these metrics, likes, shares, followers. It's a whole economy of attention. And we're all playing the game, whether we realize it or not.
But they're not saying we're powerless.
Yeah.
Right.
No, they're not. They're saying that users are constantly pushing back, finding creative ways to resist those commercial pressures. It's a constant negotiation.
And the source even suggests that SNS can, in some ways, make us more authentic.
Yeah, that's a surprising one, isn't it? The idea is that because our online lives are so persistent, so interconnected, it's harder to hide things. We can't just erase the past. So we're forced to either present a more integrated self, a self that encompasses all those different facets of our lives, or we have to confront our inconsistencies, our insincerities. It's like being held accountable by our own past selves.
But there's also the argument that SNS, they can make us less authentic, at least in certain ways.
Right. Cocking, he talks about how SNS, especially the text-based ones, they can really downplay those nonverbal cues that are so important in face-to-face interaction. Things like body language, tone of voice, facial expressions. He sees those as crucial for conveying character, for building trust.
So online, it's easier to be misunderstood.
It is. And even with video, there's a risk.